Joining me are Caroline Carpenter, a PhD in English, Early Modern Studies, just finished in fall. And James Griffith, who's a doctoral candidate in philosophy and is just about to finish his dissertation. And I know both of them from, they've been in the Writing Center's orbit for a number of years and regular attendees at Dissertation Bootcamp. I guess, you know, where are y'all in the process? How far along?
Basically starting.
Okay. Like starting, like have a topic starting, or like trying to figure out, getting your bearings starting?
Trying to write my first chapter.
Okay. So you kind of have at least an idea.
Oh, my proposal hasn't been approved
Okay.
yet.
Cool. What field?
But English.
Okay.
But it's been suggested to me by my advisor that I start tackling the first chapter.
Cool. Good.
By way of focusing, I think.
Yeah.
I'm writing. So I am. I spent all summer collecting my data. Did some of the lit review. Typed a couple of pages in that lit review, kind of first chapter part of it, and then I left it and moved to data. Collected all my data, cleaned my data, struggled with my data, and I'm hoping to finish my analysis in the next 2-3 weeks and just start writing that chapter, like the method chapter, and then go back to just focusing on just reading and writing instead of reading, writing, and going to figuring out if the data still exists or not. So that was my strategy, and that's where I am.
Sounds good.
Are you in education?
No, I'm world politics and quantitative analysis, or method.
So we're just kind of just asking everyone where they are in the process. And so if you want to share, so haven't started writing, a little bit into the dissertation, halfway through.
I'm in the process of defending my proposal.
Okay.
And so I have my first 3 chapters, which of course are, will still go into revision as I start writing more. But I have a pretty good chunk of the first 3. So now it's a matter of me now beginning and then going back and then
Education.
Of course, yes, in education.
If you got the first 3 chapters, and you call that the proposal.
Do the first 3 chapters, you mean?
Whose quals transform?
It depends on who the faculty member is.
Right.
They all have a different process.
Right, you're the only ones that, education are the only ones that really have that as part of the potential process. Everyone else does it a little bit differently.
Yeah, well, and that's it. Everyone's, each department has a different process.
Because it was 3 chapters. My proposal is 15 pages.
I have over 100 pages right now of that, so.
It's not a proposal, that's a master's thesis.
And so, again, it depends on which faculty member you have, but it does feel empowering, but at the same time, to get there, that took me a year. So to do that and go back and forth and sort of ruminate on what was happening there, so at least I feel a little bit, psychologically I feel good.
Well, good. I think that's important. I think we've been talking a lot about kind of habits, and sort of as we just did self-management. And my thought was to try to focus this hour a little more on the writing process. But like I said, because we're such a small group, I'd rather just turn it over to y'all. What keeps you up at night? Why are you here? and let's just talk.
So I just put this goal a couple of weeks to myself. I was I'm gonna write 5 pages a day. I thought 5 pages sounds reasonable, but days go by and I'm barely with 3 lines or a paragraph. So I'm trying to figure out a way to put words every day on this. I don't know, that's what I'm struggling with.
I just read a blog entry from a seasoned philosophy professor, been around for a long time. He tells all of his advisors he says don't write more, I would say set yourself a number, but don't write more than 2. Right? Think about how many pages it is you're gonna write total. Because his point was, if you write a page a day, right, then in less than a year, you'll have close to 300 pages, right? So that's philosophy dissertation, you're done by then. So a page a day is actually pretty reasonable, because what happens on those 5 days, or the 5 pages a day, doesn't happen, and then it becomes something you don't want to do the next day. You're like, oh God, I didn't do it yesterday, I didn't do it the day before, now I don't really remember how many 5 pages today. It's 5 is actually a lot for every day.
Yeah.
I sometimes do 5, sometimes do more than that, but 5 is a lot to say as an actual daily goal.
I guess my questions for everyone that's talking about a page a day is what happened before the page a day part, because I'm a compulsively process-driven writer, so I spent most of my preparation time in outline mode, and I developed a very detailed outline that then had a few words added to it and became a chapter. And so it really depends on what you call writing, because I include all of that outlining part in writing. But then once I got to the point of what I think of in my head as converting my outline to prose, that whole chapter or whatever the unit of work that I was working on happened in a couple of days. So to give an example, my dissertation is a non-traditional format dissertation. I edited 2 early modern plays and then wrapped it in a discussion of how those plays fit into Jacobean accession politics. So that's what's going on in the other chapters. And part of that was writing a lit review. And because I'm an English major, we don't really write lit review chapters. We take our literature review and sprinkle it in among everything else. It's not that we don't read and do literature review, but we incorporate, generally speaking, we incorporate our literature review into our argument chapters. And then my chair decided that she didn't want me to do that because I was functioning in a historian kind of mode, that she wanted a separate literature review chapter. Which, even though for years at the Writing Center I've taught people how to write lit reviews, and I've helped people write lit reviews, that was really kind of a scary thing for me to actually have to separate out a lit review chapter. And so what I did is I focused on doing all of the reading and obsessive compulsive note-taking about everything that was going on, thinking about what I was going to argue in the lit review chapter, huge amount of outlining, and then what I did is I used the week-long summer boot camp to write the lit review chapter. And it was about 35 or 40 pages, I think, when it was finished. But I went into that week at boot camp with an outline in hand, and I used the week-long dissertation boot camp in the summer to write this thing that was kind of scary for me. But I went into it with that outline in hand, and then finished that chapter during the boot camp. So for me, the writing process is very much about obsessive compulsive outlining, and then a sort of fairy dust process of adding a few words and then having it sort of go, here's a chapter. And that's not any more or less efficient than sitting down to write a page a day. It's just different. And so the most important part of this whole process was figuring out what process would work for me. And that was what worked for me. And so you should also figure out what process works for you. Some people are not big outliners. If you're not an outliner at all, I would really suggest that you try it. Because, and the Writing Center will help you figure out how to be a better outliner if it's never been a thing that you've really used. But it does help you maintain that feeling of control, which for me, because I'm a control freak, anytime I feel like I'm not in control is really stressful for me. And your goal in this process should really be to manage your stress. Because stress will feel like Yoda, right? Stress leads to fear, which leads to paralysis, which leads to no writing, right? And nobody wants to be in that space. And so.
And yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that, you know, having worked with graduate students for, you know, the better part of a decade now, I think one of the places where people get into trouble is by setting unrealistic expectations and then castigating themselves for not making them, right? And you know, it's like Shelby was just talking about the kind of guilt, right? And the like, and yes, I think 5 pages a day is totally unreasonable. It's way too much. And I think, you know, the related thing that Caroline's also speaking to is overemphasizing the product, right? And again, like in the Writing Center, we talk about, you know, teach writing as a process, not a product, right? And that ultimately, yes, there's a product that's going to come out of this, but the way you get there is by focusing on the process. So I wholeheartedly endorse the idea, that again, Shelby was pointing to of, just kind of like deep work or writing, right? And it's true, if you get 3 hours or 4 hours in a day, it's a good day. Close the laptop, and go to the beach.
Give yourself permission to have a life.
But that can mean then not just, that doesn't mean necessarily linear production, right? That can mean I'm going to revise the page I wrote yesterday, because when I was in the shower this morning, I thought I just kept thinking about how bad it was, or I'm going to go delete the last 3 days, because, those are productive tasks, right? And so I think if you're kind of like, must be this sort of forward march, I think that's how you can just get into trouble, whether it's sort of paralysis or just loss of focus, every time like I put down something I'm writing for a substantial amount of time, 2 weeks, which happens more often than I'd like, I have to go back and read the whole thing again. And so I'm like 30 pages into this chapter that I'm writing, and every time I pick it back up, it's like read it again, and I keep tweaking, and it gets me back into the habit. And so I don't consider that wasted time, or I don't consider that not progressing, and that you can certainly set. I think it's also good to set goals that you'll feel good about accomplishing, right? And so if it's like, and that you will accomplish, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to start at 1 page a day, right? Or even just 1 page of writing or 2 hours of writing. The thing I was going to sort of talk about, and that's also been coming up, all day, is this mantra, write first. And that means all of the above, right? That your dissertation is your top priority, right? And if it's not, it will be a much more arduous task. Try to write before you do other things during the day, if you can. And kind of keep it, in the forefront of your consciousness. But also, write doesn't mean produce finished pages. It can mean, sort of journaling or free writing. It can mean, sort of outlining. Some people, I know, this doesn't work for me, but a very good friend of mine wrote his dissertation using screenwriting software, which lets you storyboard and stuff. Have you tried this? Scrivener does this, yeah. So you can sort of write in, non-linear chunks and then move them around, as if you were storyboarding a movie or something. And so then, they're just breaking that linear flow, I think, can be really productive. And just sort of takes that inexorable momentum kind of out of it and gives you a little more latitude to actually say what you want to say rather than feel like you have to produce pages.
Another thing that helped me in terms of productivity was abandoning the idea of the perfect paragraph. My committee chair is kind of famous at this university for being one of the hardest people to write for in terms of your prose has to be really good. And at the beginning of my process, of sort of the whole phase of writing, I found that worrying about what she was going to say about the prose that I had when I was going to initially submit something to her got me into a state of not being able to actually write anything. And then I realized that my entire experience with her through coursework was actually much more positive than that, that I rarely produced anything that was perfect, right, loaded term, but I rarely produced anything that was even good enough the first time around. But that when I gave her something, she would tell me what she wanted me to do to it. And so when I remembered that, and I realized that, and then decided to let myself just write some words, even if they weren't what I thought of as the perfect words, and give them to her, and let her do her job, right? We're all paying fees while we're in doctoral study. That includes advice from our professors, chairs, etc. That when I just gave her something and let her do her job, which is tell me how to improve upon it, it was a whole lot easier to just write once I didn't feel like it had to be perfect. Especially for the things that were more stressful to me, like the lit review chapter, where I was like, oh, I've never had to write a lit review before, and Lorian's a historian, and you know, and it has to be perfect, and then I was like, no, just write some words, and then let her tell you what to do to it. And then shockingly, when I gave her the lit review, she sent it back to me and said, this is great. And I was like, okay, that was weird. But I couldn't actually write until I let go of this idea that it had to be great. And so
I'd say that's not just for composition, it's also just for the whole writing process.
Yeah.
I mean, if you haven't yet, collaborate with somebody, write a paper with somebody, and then try to think about that process. When I write I collaborate with a colleague on the East Coast all the time, and I don't worry about it being perfect when I'm writing, and she's going to see the next draft, and she's going to add her stuff. I just send it to her, because it's her job to like say what's wrong with the pieces, and and then I do the same thing with hers. So in the same way, not just with the composition, but with the argument, or whether you know what you're talking about. Like, that's your committee's job, right? Is to tell you, no, you're missing this point, or whatever. And as a philosopher, we're trained to anticipate all the counter arguments, and so I spent a lot of time addressing concerns that nobody may have ever asked me to address. And until I finally said, you know what, I have to write this next chapter. I'm just going to write it, and if I'm missing something, they'll tell me. But that's what this whole thing is about. And I wrote, 40 pages in a few weeks instead of 10 pages over 40 weeks.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the reason, and not to sound like a broken record, but I think the reason that that deep outlining was so useful to me is because I didn't really have 4 hours a day to sit down and write. I needed to be able to work in smaller increments because I teach, and I was working at the Writing Center. I had all these other things impacting my time, and so I needed to be able to work productively for an hour at a time, and that meant that I really needed a discrete piece. And maybe that's just write a paragraph, right? But I didn't have, as Mark was saying, I didn't have the amount of time where I could come back to something and have to reread it and then figure out what I was going to say and sort of do all of that rework. I needed to be able to say, okay, I have an hour, I'm going to write a paragraph. What am I going to write a paragraph about? My outline gave me that ability to compartmentalize my work into much smaller pieces and still be productive if I had an hour or whatever. And it also let me really see where the holes were. And so it's like, oh, I don't really have enough about this piece. I need to go and find 3 more articles to fill in that hole. And so even when I had to go back and do a little sort of step back from the writing phase into the research phase, it made that piece of researching much more manageable, because I wasn't sort of going, oh, I need to go and read everything in the world, right? It was, I need 3 articles that do this thing, that fit in this hole, that address this gap, and I'm not going to look at anything that doesn't even potentially help me with that. And so it helped me not have scope creep in terms of reading. There's always scope creep. That's
by scope creep, you mean you're like, oh, if I I read this, then I gotta read this, then I gotta read this.
Yeah,
and,
where
what
you
about that
feel,
footnote?
where you
Yeah.
feel like what you had initially defined as the parameters of your dissertation starts to sort of mushroom out in one spot or another. And part of your job is to manage scope creep. That if you find that something is mushrooming out in one place, you really need to pull it back in another place so that it doesn't become, you know, a million-page dissertation, because nobody wants that. Not your chair, not you, not anybody.
I mean, that's a good point because I struggle with that, and I think that's why I left my literature review for a while. I was like, let me just go back to the data and make sure I have everything. Is because I would be reading something, and then, you know, in every article there's literature review in my field, so like you get to see the history behind like whatever their argument is. So I start going back and reading those articles, and then from those articles I'm going back and reading their. So I was like, I get lost in my lit review, and then I just dropped everything and went back, and I was like, focus on my question and just collected the variables. But I think that's one of my.
You need to remember what the purpose of the literature review in your dissertation is. And the purpose of the literature review in your dissertation is not to prove that you know everything about everything that's ever been said, but that you have read enough of your particular everything to know for sure that the research of your dissertation meets a need and fills a gap.
Yeah.
Right? The purpose of your lit review is just to argue that there is a gap. It exists. I'm filling it. The end.
Yeah.
And that is a difficult thing to do. I mean, my lit review was, the argument of my lit review was to prove that we weren't looking at the politics of succession politics in a particular way, and that these plays would help us do that, and then nothing else. Because it doesn't matter what your field is, whether it's English or philosophy or whatever, you can't possibly read everything and cover everything, right? I mean, there are thousands and thousands of books and articles about Jacobean succession politics. All I needed to do was to survey the field enough to say, there's a hole, I'm filling it, thanks very much.
Right. And more than that, I mean,
And that is the same for everybody.
you're describing the current state of knowledge too, right? So as you start getting back in history, like there's a reason those other people wrote literature reviews too. So you don't have to go back and read those things, right? They've already been summarized for you and placed into context. And you know, there's sort of a diminishing utility the further back you go. And obviously there's seminal articles in every field, you know. But yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Caroline. I think it's about thinking about your rhetorical purposes, right? And of course, those are evolving though too. I mean, a literature review is always going to exist in a dialectical relationship to your argument. So as your argument evolves, the needs of your literature review are going to keep changing too.
Yeah.
But you know, it's the they say and the I say. But nonetheless, you know, that bearing in mind that it's there to justify your argument and full stop. That's all there is to it. And I think people do have a tendency to treat it as a survey.
Yeah. Paul's already proved that you're qualified to write
Yeah.
a dissertation, right? That's not the point of your lit review in your dissertation. So,
That's part of the importance of the outline. I think there are a few things that are going to vary from person to person, and so when you start, self-examination is really, really important. So how much of a need for outlining do you have? Everybody should outline. I think that's true. And how much and exactly how you're going to outline is going to vary. How much of a priority is your dissertation? How important is it and how urgent is it as compared to the other things in your life that are important and more urgent? How well can you write a dissertation and also be working? How much time do you need in order to be productive? Because I think the thing with whether it's 1 page, 3 hours, whatever, 1 hour is that continuity, so that you're not having to come back to stuff. And I think the idea behind that professor who said don't write more than a page a day is just, if you know that you've got more and you just keep going until you have no more, then the next time you come, you got nothing, right? And you're not thinking about it anymore. Whereas if you stop yourself at some point, you go, I know I can still say more, let me jot down some of this stuff so I don't forget where I was going. It's still rolling around in your head, and then when you come back to it, you keep writing, you just keep that progress going. But how much of that do you need to do? Some people have to write a lot. Some people can write a little bit every day. You have to figure out what kind of person you are when you can stop working. And it's the same with outlining. I don't outline with as great as detail as she is. I'm probably somewhere toward her side from the middle. I outline as argument. I make my argument with my major premise. Each of my chapters is a major premise in my argument. And then within each chapter there are sub-arguments, and so I do that. And then when you're doing your literature review, you're looking for specific pieces of information that fill those premises. So everybody's going to do a little bit different, and you have to figure out on all these different questions which one's going to work for you.
Sorry, just as a totally, as part of the story, my advisor actually, when he was finishing his dissertation, his committee chair was like retiring or something, right? So he had this very firm deadline. He had to get it done. And he kind of, planned it out and said, okay, to finish this on time, I need to write 2 pages a day, right? And he said, so that was it. He'd get up in the morning and he'd write 2 pages. Sometimes it would take an hour, and then he'd go to the beach. Sometimes it would take 12 hours, and he'd be breaking his head, against the wall, but just 2 pages and then stop. And, just let it go and move on to the next day.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Can you discuss like different tips of outlining? I'm not great at outlining, so I mean, I just think of major topic and then, all right, I feel like, oh, I did outline, so I just write a couple things under it. It's like, oh, I have an outline, but I don't think that's a good outline.
I've got an old school answer to
Yeah,
this,
go
but if you want to talk about your own process, you've touted your detailed outlining. I want to know how you do it.
Yeah, I treated all of my chapters as if they were journal articles from the perspective of outlining. So, like Amy says, start out with what is the major thing that you are arguing, and then how are you going to prove that this thing is true in a very task-oriented thing, right? So, what are all of the things that I feel I need to do in a positive kind of way, right? What are the things that I feel I need to do? And then what are the potential objections that I also need to handle? How would I deal with those? I put all of the evidence that I'm going to use into my outline with my specific quotes and sources and all of that kind of stuff. And I put all of the commentary and analysis that I'm going to use to explain that evidence to my reader also into the outline. Essentially, the whole chapter is in the outline. And then I add what I really think of as connective tissue, right? The prettying it up words that make the sentences make sense. And then it's the chapter.
Yeah, no brain, no headache. I was gonna say, I mean, for me, I start with the evidence, and so for me, an outline is about the compilation and organization of evidence. And again, I mean, I work in a text-based field, so it's a little different. And I will often do this on a legal pad with a pen rather than in front of a screen because I feel a little freer on paper. But much as Caroline's suggesting, like, if I will have sort of lists of evidence or my notes that has page numbers and quotations and all this, and I'll try to put it into buckets in different ways. And then as I start drafting an outline, just Roman numeral 1, A. I'm not going to get beyond that. I just start dashing after that. But it's really just plugging in evidence, and then it's just makes the argument, and then parenthesis, Smith 72, Jones 86, Griffith 47. You just get all the evidence that supports that claim, sort of in that place in the outline, as being as detailed and specific as I can. And I feel very uncomfortable ever making an argument that I don't have evidence for. So, so the evidence really is providing the guts of the outline. But it makes it a sorting task. It's it's something I can do in front of the TV. If I've got my notes and I've got a pad of paper, I can just sort of sit there and sort evidence. And then when I'm trying to translate it, I may not use all the evidence that I've put under a particular subpoint or whatever, but it's all there. right? And so I can go like, I might go back and be like, oh, Griffith 42, that doesn't say at all what I thought it said. How did I get that? You know, like, I was totally wrong about that. Well, thank God I've got Jones, 86 to solve this problem. So, I think that's a useful, sort of building the outline from the evidence, because I think one of the areas where people in general get into trouble is when they think they know what the argument is, and then they're going to find the evidence to support the argument. You've got to work from the evidence to the argument. Like, what can you prove? When I was dissertating, so that was 10 years ago. I did a lot of that on paper, and I've actually had a hard time sort of figuring out how to manage that workflow in a more digital environment. What's that?
Scapel.
Scapel? Is that the tool?
Scapel and Scrivener work pretty well.
All right, I'm gonna check that out.
Scapel is kind of a, when I described it to Shelley, she said it sounded like mind mapping software. It's kind of like, it is to mind mapping, and I guess what Prezi is to PowerPoints. It's just, you have this big white, it's like basically if you had a roll of paper, except that the nice difference between that and legal pads, and the same thing with Scrivener, is you can grab this junk that you, when you're outlining, you're like, oh crap, this should have been up here.
Yeah.
Well, now you can just grab that stuff, slide it down, and so you can move the stuff around, draw stuff to it, you connect it, move your connections. And it's, when I say it's like Prezi, it's because you can just keep moving it, keep expanding out and change where your center is, because you started over here, now you've got stuff like this, and you realize this is going to be the main argument, and so you start moving stuff around this way.
I became a deeply committed Evernote user during my dissertation phase, not so much for the sort of moving stuff around things, but for feeling like I had control of all of the pieces, because I had so many sources, because I sort of had the weirdest dissertation ever, and so I had this sort of whole body of work on textual criticism because I was editing, then I had this whole body of work on succession politics because that's what situated my plays, and then I had this enormous body of stuff that was related to the actual textual apparatus of the plays themselves, everything that was involved in the footnotes and everything. So I had these sort of three very distinct sort of fields of stuff that would have gotten out of control very quickly, and Evernote really worked for me it's an information management system. And so that was really useful. But I do have to sort of throw in with Mark, I didn't do it in the dissertation chapters because I was very much working in Evernote because that's where everything was. But when I was in coursework, I was kind of famous for doing all of my course papers and starting them on index cards, and then coming to the writing center and meeting with my writing partner, and more on writing partners in a second, but meeting with my writing partner and doing a lot of moving note cards around on the table, and we have photographs of me and Shada with Caroline's coursework papers spread out all over the table on 3x5 cards, so that we could say, what happens if you move this chunk up here, and then sort of look at it and go, yeah, that sort of does make sense. When I was in Qualls, that process moved to a huge whiteboard in the hallway at my house and moved to sticky notes. And I moved sticky notes around a lot with what I was planning during Qualls. And then when I was dissertating, it moved into Evernote and became all electronic. But there is sometimes an enormous advantage to that sort of tactile, hands-on, what happens if I move stuff around kind of phase of things. The writing partner thing, I think, was one of the most beneficial things that I had. A sort of not unspoken, but actually agreed upon deal to, I'll read your stuff, you read my stuff. We won't feel like we're impinging upon each other's time because it's a fair system of exchange. And so I always had somebody that I could have read something and say, does it make sense to you? Am I even on the right planet here? Because I've done all of this stuff and it just sounds somebody that you can have that kind of equitable thing with. If you really don't have anybody in your life that will do that, set up a weekly appointment with somebody at the Writing Center where you do something like send something that you've written as an online one week and then come in and have a conversation about it the following week. That can work really well. But dissertating was the most, other than quals, which, let's face it, is a big black hole of horribleness. Dissertating could have been for me a really isolated process. I was working at the Writing Center, and so I was mostly coordinating boot camp. So I was at boot camp, but not really as a boot camp attendee as much. So boot camp can really help. Having a writing partner helped me more, because it wasn't dependent on boot camp rolling on a predetermined schedule. And so I really had, I had two writing partners. One is a person who is in my field and who is able to sort of look at stuff from a subject matter expert point of view. And then the other person was my mom, who read every single thing that I wrote more than a few times, and of course clearly is not an early modern British literature specialist, but she was really excellent at telling me whether or not what I had written made sense outside of the context of my specialization, which I think is also really valuable. And it didn't matter what I wrote, she told me it was amazing. Which is really, don't giggle, it's really important to have someone tell you that you're smart and that you can do this and that you will finish it and what you're doing is really great. And so, you know, my husband read everything that I wrote too, and it didn't matter what I wrote, he read it and he handed it back and said, it's good.
Yeah.
I was like, yes, right? And then I would have him explain it to me, right? Did you understand what I was saying? And he would be able to, and I was like, yes, okay, I haven't fallen off the edge of the world into jargon land, which can happen to us when we're dissertating, right? Dissertations need to be accessible to non-expert readers, something that we frequently lose track of as well.
If you don't have somebody who can read everything, because I didn't have anybody who has the time or the inclination to read that much philosophy. But
Center will do it for you.
find somebody who will listen to you talk about it. And sometimes that's even better, forcing yourself to talk about it.
I didn't give anybody any choice. If you know me, if you've heard about my dissertation many times, well, it was happening.
But if you talk through the points you're trying to make, if you can't make them talking to somebody,
You're in trouble right
Yeah.
about it.
and sometimes once you do make them talk to somebody, you go, oh, that's the way I should have been writing it. And then you like interrupt yourself, tell them you don't want to talk to them anymore, and you go away and you start writing. So that can be extremely helpful. The other good thing about partners and boot camps is setting up some kind of accountability. If you have a way to tie deadlines of your things you want to work on to external, independently important deadlines, like a submission deadline for a conference or for some essay prize or keeping your financial aid or whatever, bet with somebody, an enormous amount of money, somebody who won't be sympathetic to your excuses, right? Because if you just say, well, I'll do it and then I won't give myself chocolate that weekend, you'll give yourself chocolate anyway, it doesn't matter. So you need some sort of accountability if the writing partner can say that.
I promised my advisor specific dates, and she is not the kind of woman that you disappoint. So when you commit to Lorraine Farrell that you're going to give her something on such and such a date, you tend to do it if you've been working with her for any amount of time. I mean, it's got to be someone that you're enough afraid of that you'll actually meet your deadlines. But yes, accountability.
Well, this is an idea that we've heard kind of throughout the day, and some of the faculty this morning and some of the other sessions, we've talked a lot about the idea of forming writing groups, and which is, you know, kind of having more than one writing partner, basically. And I wholeheartedly endorse this as a solution, because I think it can serve a lot of these purposes. And there are different ways one can organize a writing group. I mean, there are a couple writing groups here that the Writing Center helps facilitate. Basically, we get them rooms where they actually get together and write. Right? They're having their own boot camp on, you know, Wednesday night from 2 to 10. Right? I in graduate school I had two other guys that we're all working on very similar projects, and we basically met once a month. We circulated someone's whatever, right? A chapter, a piece of a chapter, down the line it was like a job talk. Just someone's text was, you know, our object in common. And, you know, we met at the bar and like just had beers and talked about work, you know,
Which made
talked
everybody's
about,
work seem really good.
what's that?
Which made everybody's
This
work seem
chapter
really
is
good.
Right,
the
yeah, no,
best
yeah.
chapter I've ever read in my life.
You know, but it was like, you know, someone was accountable and there was a support structure and that's a really common, like, way that dissertators get through this process. And I've actually been surprised at how little of it seems to be going on here.
Yeah.
And I think it's helpful if there are people in your field. I think it can work if it's people. The three of you could form a writing group, right? And even though your projects are all totally different, because the way you talk about each other's work is just about the writing, right? It's about the argumentation and the rhetoric. It's not about the expertise.
Something that happened to me that I wasn't expecting, sort of right in the middle of my dissertating process, as I was about to launch into writing the chapters part of the project, I served as a conference moderator at a conference in Chicago, where one of the people on my panel, I had actually opted to do the panel because I'm like, oh, hey, look, that's a paper about some stuff that's connected to what I'm doing, and that'll be interesting to read. I wasn't interested in reading anything that wouldn't be interesting to me at that point. I was like, so I went to Chicago to moderate this panel at a conference and got to talking about this woman's paper with her. We went and had lunch, and then we went to the other panels together in the afternoon, and then we kept talking, and we kept talking after the conference. She became a remote writing partner for me, and we're still very good friends now. She's finishing up her dissertation. But we did, I mean, it was an unexpected writing connection that came about sort of outside of the CGU context. And so if you go to a conference, look for people who share your interests and then say, hey, you know, would you mind, you know, I was really fascinated by your paper, you know, perhaps we can trade, you know, chapter, because frequently conference papers are dissertation chapters, right? Which means that these people are doing the same thing that you're doing. Ask someone who's working in the same kind of field as you are, you know, hey, would you like to exchange chapters and see? The worst thing that can happen is that they can say no. The best thing that can happen is that you find someone that you totally click with that you then, you know, which was the case with me. And
But yeah, you can even, you know, work, a writing group remotely like that. Whether it's, you know, you're both like logged into Google Docs with shared access to, you know, just so you can see that the other person's there. Or I was told that before my time that there was someone who used to come to boot camp by just Skyping in.
Yep.
But like, so no one's talking to anyone, right? Like everyone's just sort of,
she
she just dial Skype
right.
and just like her head's just on a little screen sitting there, right? And she's working on her stuff in silence,
Solidarity.
right? But yeah, it was that act of belonging and sort of connecting with others. And there are a lot of ways to do that, and it's absolutely crucial because otherwise this is the dark night of the soul, and like you need other people. The solitude will kill you.
No, after the last boot camp, before the holidays, I have another friend who we tried to be writer partners together. And then another friend, we decided that we're going to do the Google Doc. And we pushed it till after the holidays, and then one of us actually took the initiative and created the Google Doc. It was January 5th, I think. And it was the date, and she put what she had to do. And I ran away from it, got scared. But today, because of all the talk today on the break, I was like, all right, I opened my computer and I started filling in the Google Doc.
But maybe then you're also learning that kind of task representation is anxiety producing, and that maybe it's like, and this comes up, I know this came up over the summer, the ways in which people set objectives for themselves, like sometimes that kind of task representation can be intimidating. If you're like, finish chapter 2, that's what I have to do, right? Like, it feels like totally overwhelming and unreasonable. But if you can, even what Shamini's talking about sort of breaking that down into smaller tasks as opposed to goals, I think you can make that manageable. But maybe you just sharing your objectives that way doesn't work, right? Or seeing what someone else is doing, and then you sort of like, you're comparing, you're like, oh my God, she's gonna do all that today, you know, like, and oh, like, maybe that doesn't work for you, right? And so again, it's that kind of listening to your own, I'm a very big believer in listening to your own anxieties. Because this is an anxious making process. I didn't write for about a year and a half while I was dissertating. Just stopped. Writer's block. It's awful. And I was in therapy.
Especially because it feeds on itself.
Yeah.
Every single minute that you don't write makes the minute that you don't write next 10 times worse.
Yeah.
And my therapist finally told me to just like start paying attention to my procrastination. Like, why are you doing it? What kind of thing is it that's making you get distracted, right? Like, what are you focusing on at the moment you get distracted? And where's the anxiety in it, right? Trying to locate, you know, and feel it, right? And like, feel the anxiety. Don't like, procrastination and distraction are ways of avoiding, right? And they're ways of fleeing from things that don't feel good. But like, actually trying to sit with the feeling and let it kind of feel awkward is like, it kind of loses some of its power. You know, that's not so
You
bad.
also have to give yourself permission to flee people that are not good for you. At the beginning of my process, there was a person that I knew who, I don't know if it's the case with your Google Doc friend, but this person's, it seemed like this person's use for the rest of us that were in the communication group was to point out how much this person was doing, right? I did this, and I did this, and I did that, and look at how productive I am, and all of the rest of us just sort of went, oh. You know, it's like, we're terrible, pathetic human beings who don't deserve to be in your orbit. And it actually took me a
They're
little
not like
while.
that.
Well, it took me a little while to figure out that this person really just wanted us to say how fabulous this person was. That was a need that we were filling for them. To say, you know, yeah, this is great, you're doing all this stuff, right? Aren't you amazing? But the downside of that was that we all felt terrible by comparison. And then later on it came out that this person wasn't actually making all the progress that they were saying, right? It was a completely, you know, sort of self-bolstering kind of thing, right? And the whole thing was just destructive for everybody involved. So, you know, if you get in a situation where there's somebody that you're like, oh, you know, your intellectual brain tells you that this should be admirable, but it just makes you feel bad, listen to the part that makes you feel bad. Don't let yourself get sucked into anything that doesn't make you feel good about what you're doing. Because you will do a good enough job of making yourself not feel good about what you're doing often enough that you don't need any outside people to help you with that.
Two caveats that are on the opposite side of a couple of things we've said. One is this, don't be around people who make you feel really bad, but also try not to get caught up in the people that you have so much fun with that you don't actually write. Like, you talk about your projects all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Every session is great, and you leave there feeling great, but you never get anything done. I've had a couple of those. Or the outlining and task setting. There are some people who every boot camp I go to, they're still doing the same outlining or task setting, and you just start picking at, you never stop outlining your task setting to actually do the work. And so you have to find that balance.
Well, we should start wrapping up, but I want to see if there are any other questions. And if there's anything y'all wanted to talk about that we haven't touched on. So, from the audience, yeah, I saw James, you had some notes.
I think we've talked about most of it.
Do make use of the Writing Center.
Totally.
Nobody else here, not even the people on your committee, care as much about your writing as the people who work at the Writing Center do. And it's not just because I used to be one. But
Well, and we're some of our own best customers. I mean, the people who work in the Writing Center come to the Writing Center.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's especially true if you are coming from an academic background where you've always considered yourself to be a pretty good writer. English majors are notorious for not seeking out collaborative writing experiences because, generally speaking, English majors have been told they're pretty good writers all the way throughout their academic careers. don't tend to use writing centers. I didn't start using a writing center until I became a grad student. And then it was, you know, it was like the clouds opened up and the beam of light came down, and I realized how much better of a writer I could have been if I had been using a writing center all along.
Oh, and, you know, this is hard. I mean, I think that, like, maybe that goes without saying, but, like, writing is hard. It's hard for everyone, right? When it's working well, it's still hard, and it's frustrating, right? And so anything you can do to like, take some of that burden is a good idea. But it's hard for the best of us. Like, I often tell my students, like, no one writes well, right? And so, you know, it's, and so yes, taking advantage of things like the Writing Center is immensely valuable. I mean, I would say that in a writing group, and you can go pretty far.
And give yourself permission to screw up.
Yep.
If you don't write for a while, that's okay. Because the more you focus on not having done it, the harder it will be for you to get back to it. So, you know, let yourself say, oh yeah, well, I didn't write anything at all last week. That's okay.
It's like, you know, sort of
I'll
diet
write-
and exercise, right? Other kinds
Yep.
of regimes that you
I
give
will write a
yourself,
few
like,
sentences next
I
week
did
and
go
it
to
will
the
be
gym.
fine, right?
forgive
But-
yourself and move on.
Yep, nobody does this perfectly at all.
I would say it's extremely important to protect your time. We've talked about doing so much or having so many hours, but it's really easy, especially if you have other jobs, kids, spouses, whatever else, to take care of all the other things that seem urgent and just push your writing on to the next day and to the next day.
Yeah.
My house was never as clean as it was until I ran into a difficult spot in a chapter.
I learned
And
to cook
then,
during my
spick and
dissertation.
span, the laundry was done, I mean, cupboards got organized that hadn't seen
Start
organization
learning how to
in years.
cook.
I have a
Eat
friend
healthy.
who baked pies through her dissertation.
But man, you have to be aware of those strategies that you use for avoidance.
Yeah.
So I would say, do your best to make the amount of time that you spend or don't spend on your dissertation tangible in some way. Like, some people, as soon as they're done with coursework, they stop taking student loans, great. But then they start working so much, and so they're paying their doctoral fees over and over and over again and never going anywhere because they're working so much.
Money down the drain.
So you might, on the flip side, take out the same amount of loans that you've been taking out, but then calculate how much is that an hour, or, you know, make it your job and realize when you're not beating yourself up about not writing, but when you're just not working because you're slacking off or you're procrastinating, that's like you're not going to work.
Yeah.
There was a whole semester at the beginning of my dissertating process where I used a handy little app on my phone called A-Tracker, A-T-R-A-C-K-E-R, that basically is a thing where you tap the activity tag for whatever it is that you're doing. And it just keeps track of how much time you spend doing everything, every day. And so I had one for housework, and one for dissertating, and one for working out, and TV, and so I carried my phone around with me and kept track of every single minute of my day, from the time that I woke up until the time I went to bed, for a week. And boy, that was illuminating.
It's totally like that.
So if you find yourself not making as much progress as you want, try installing the app, it's free, and use it for a week to see where your time is going. And then, you know, and then you can engage in deal making with yourself, right? If I, you know, shift 4 hours into dissertating out of whatever other category it is currently, whatever other bucket it's going into, and then reward yourself, and then track again the next week, and see if you can do that. But I really needed that visibility, because I felt like I was doing really productive things, but not making the kind of progress that I wanted to make, and I didn't quite understand why, because I felt like I was doing good things. And then I realized that it was that my house was really clean and stuff, so.
I was telling somebody before we started here that, and I can't remember exactly how the person sketched it out, but somebody was teaching a group of us some time ago, just what the difference between what's important and what's urgent.
Yeah, this came up this morning in the faculty panel, and the quadrants of, yeah.
So you have, for me, it's you have to learn find ways to make things that are important to you urgent, rather than letting things that are not important become important. Because there are lots of things that, I mean, it's important to have a job, but not everything that you do for your job is really that important. It's urgent because it's gotta be done by this time and it's gonna be done, but then we put all of the hours in a day to doing this thing perfectly, whether it's lecture notes, or framing, or whatever it is, or taking on another job and getting more hours. And then, same thing as the taking out loans thing. 3 years later, we're still working that job, we haven't done anything with our dissertation, which we tell ourselves is important, but we haven't allowed to be urgent. That's why it's about protecting the time, find ways to make it urgent.
One last thing, is there's not actually anything that says that you can't submit your intent to receive a degree form way ahead of time. If you're trying to motivate yourself to finish in a
What are the
particular semester,
consequences?
you can submit that form. I intend to receive a degree in, of whatever,
2018.
right?
Can you,
No, you for the semester.
for the semester, so, not like 3 semesters down.
No, it's gotta be for that semester.
No,
Or the
actually it
next.
doesn't, because well, unless they've changed the rule, but Faye, when she finished her quals, submitted her form for 12 months out and said, I'm going to finish this dissertation in a year, and submitted her intent to receive a degree.
Well, that's only a year.
So big,
Yeah, I think within that year.
Yeah, so if you want something to motivate yourself, right, submit the form. The other thing that I allowed myself, that I used as a sort of motivational thing, was I allowed myself to think about and dream about, when I was driving or in the shower or whatever, my acknowledgements page. What was I going to write on the acknowledgements page of my dissertation, for who I was going to thank and how I was going to thank them, right? Because it made it real in my head that I was going to have a dissertation. I had an acknowledgements page, but I didn't let myself draft it. I didn't let myself put fingers to keyboard on that page until it was done. So it was almost like a promise to myself of, you will get to write this thing. So you're allowed to think about it, right? Because it makes the finishing real. But I didn't let myself actually draft it until I had turned in the last chapter, and I was like, yes, I can write my acknowledgements now, right? And then, yeah, until I had,
That's another thing that can be helpful with the boot camps or writing groups, is that you can, when you finish coursework, you lose your coda. And you might be on the same timeline, or you might not be, but if you get into groups or dissertation, you find other people who, maybe not in your discipline, but they're on that same track now, they're gonna finish. And then it can also make that deadline meaningful, kind of like submitting your intended degree. Hey, we're all gonna finish next May, right? And then you submit those forms together, and then you have, so it becomes meaningful again, this deadline, that you're all gonna walk together.
Well, we should probably end it there for the day.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
if you want my email, to email me questions that you think of after the fact, or just to say, hey, I was in that panel and my life sucks and I hate this dissertating thing, what should I do? I'm happy to give my email if anybody wants a person to call.
And you can always track Caroline down through the writing center. I've got contact information.
I'm never far away.
I would invite you to join us over in Berkeley for the reception.
Your tuition dollars at work.
And we get
Yeah.
to take a break from all this talking and actually